right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. First off, I want to welcome you to today's webinar, sponsored by Altero, about troubleshooting Microsoft Hyper-V. Specifically, we're going to tell 4 tales from the trenches that Didier and I have run into over the years here. So with me today is Didier Van Hoy. How you doing, my friend?
I'm doing just fine. Just had to mute myself there. So.
Gotcha. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a couple of introductions here, and then we're going to get into really what today's presentation is all about. We're going to talk about a number of different situations, starting with some basic stuff, and then getting into some more nitty-gritty advanced items like networking and CSV resources, and then we'll tell some other stuff about preventing yourself from shooting yourself in the foot as well. So we've got some good stuff lined up here today to talk about. So, and then at the end we're going to do a Q&A. So there's going to be questions throughout the webinar. So if you could hold on to those until the end of the webinar, we'll have a Q&A section at the end where we can handle those questions piece by piece. So again, like I said, we're going to start with some introductions. So first off, again, I'm Andy Serwich, and I am a technical evangelist for Altero Software. And prior to working for Altero Software, I had the distinct pleasure of working in the managed services field for about 10 years. So I've kind of seen this, that, and everything else. It's interesting what you see from a service provider perspective coming into these environments that you don't know. So a lot of my interesting tales from the trenches stem from my years doing that. So the last 7 years I've really focused on virtualization, cloud services, and the Microsoft Server Stack, but I also do a little bit of VMware, Linux, and network security as well. If you're interested in reviewing any of the stuff that I blog about, I have a blog out on the altero.com website /Hyper-V. So I blog there along with another of other individuals. And if you're interested in following me on Twitter, my Twitter hashtag is right there. And we'll switch over to Didier.
So hi, I'm Didier Van Hoy. I've been working at IT quite a long time, and I mainly work as a Wintel infrastructure technical architect. I focus on Hyper-V and everything that goes with Hyper-V, and that means just about anything: storage, networking, high availability, and today also the cloud with Azure. I do tend to blog a lot, speak a lot, or as much as I can. And by doing that, you might better know me by working hard in IT, and there's a link to my blog if you haven't found that one yet, and my Twitter handle is on the screen as well, so feel free to check those out and get some more information.
Sounds good. So real quick intro about the sponsor. Again, I work for Altero Software, and Altero Software is a fast-growing developer of easy-to-use and pretty awesome backup software. We're used by about 30,000 SMBs. Our flagship product is Altero VM Backup, and if you're interested in finding out more, the link to it is right there on the slide, altero.com/VM Backup. So with that, we'll kick off with what you came here to see today. So, tale number 1. This is a situation that I ran into probably a year or two back. The background is this particular customer was primarily a VMware shop, small 1-2 host type situation. They were migrating from VMware to Hyper-V. And this really comes down to a best practices issue. So we had a newly formed 2-node cluster. I'll get to why cluster is in quotations there in more in a second. But what was happening was NTFS was corrupting regularly on virtual machines. The corruption was so bad that at times the virtual machines would be unable to boot, and there were a couple of virtual machines where recovery from backup was needed. And really what you're going to find out here is that best practices and documentation were followed. What it really came down to was they had not set up clustering correctly inside of their organization. They hadn't set up cluster shared volumes. So what was happening was the 2 hosts in this particular cluster were constantly fighting over the storage. The clustered shared volume wasn't in place, controlling access to blocks on the storage. So me off to this was anytime I suspect some sort of underlying storage issue or some sort of weird clustering issue, I always run the cluster validation wizard. Excuse me, the cluster valid wizard. And I think Didier, on this next slide, we've got a couple of screenshots of that tool and some other utilities that we can use to help, figure things out in that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, clustering has become a lot easier over the years in the new editions of Windows, but still you need to make sure everything is tipped up because it's paramount to a real high available solution. But actually getting things right, there's a lot of tools in the box. The Validate Cluster Wizard or Test Cluster with PowerShell will really help you make sure that everything is as it should be. And if you get a clean bill of health from that wizard and you have supported hardware, your cluster is supported. And just running this tool could prevent so many issues for people, but because it tends to be a bit like your better half that keeps telling you what you should be doing better, but it's very useful in that way. So it's in the GUI, you can use it with PowerShell. You can run test cluster list, which will show you everything it will test. You can play with ignore or include, so you can work in a positive way, include only this and then it will ignore the rest, or you can say ignore inventory and then it will just ignore any other tests. So it's a very useful tool, and I really encourage you to check it out, because this is the, let's say, the proactive way to make sure that you don't run into trouble. Now, no matter how good you are, no matter how lucky you are, bad things happen to good people, and when things go bad, there's a enormously handy tool that will help you get all the relevant information to the support people at Microsoft, for example. So that's get cluster log. And if you have a cluster that's multiple nodes, and collecting logs on multiple nodes is a tedious business, so what you can do is just say get cluster log, put a destination in there, and if you want to a time span in minutes, and then you can just collect all the logs you need in a central location, zip them up, and send them off to the support people. And in 2016, it's become even better. There is more relevant information in there. Also, the relevant event logs are put in there. So basically, you've got everything you need to get started in the best possible way with opening a support portal right at your fingertips with a single command line in PowerShell. So we just wanted to make sure that you knew about that and that we needed to use it. Perhaps the biggest little, the biggest little tip here is the time span thing here, right? It's not really a time span, it's in minutes. So if you use time span, just say total minutes from a time span and then it's okay. It's a little, it will trip you over sometimes. So Andy, to you.
Yeah, I'm going to say this, these two utilities here are kind of, step one in my troubleshooting toolbox. So keep these in mind as you move on with your troubleshooting efforts and in most clustering type situations.
Absolutely. And as Andy was talking about corruption, well, let's talk about some issues you might get with advanced features. So as you might know, Windows Server 2012, R2, and also Sigyn have a lot of quite advanced features to offload certain workloads to other technology or devices. You can offload certain work to the storage array via ODX. You can leverage unmap, where you can offload certain things to the network stack, which is great because you save resources on your virtualization host that can be used to run virtual machines. Basically, that's what you're in business for. The problem with them is that when they work good, they are very, very powerful, but they sometimes have issues. Sometimes you have issues with bugs in the Windows operating system. Sometimes they have bugs with the vendors, their firmware. And then you can run into trouble. And ODX has given us issues with CSV, in combination with CSV with backups in the past, that took quite a while to get fixed completely. And what happened is that your CSVs went offline. There have also been bugs with during storage live migrations that having ODX enabled on certain SANs, you would get data corruption. And data corruption means you will have to resort to backup. And it might not be a surprise, this is a webcast by a backup vendor, and no matter how good the quality of your setup is, no matter how good the hardware is you use, bad things can happen. and making sure that you can recover from that is rather important. So that's why we call out ODX, because, well, it's one of those advanced features. Another one we've seen where we struggled with was VMQ. We won't go into details what VMQ is or does completely, but it's an offload where the interrupts used by the virtual machines to parse the incoming traffic are sent to a certain queue to a certain processor. So you can scale a lot better. Not one single processor on the host has to handle all network traffic for those virtual machines. And it also enables virtual RSS, which means that a virtual machine can use more than one virtual processor to handle incoming traffic. So it's quite important to do high performance, highly scalable Hyper-V clustering. Unfortunately, we've seen a lot of issues with drivers and firmware, and also bugs in Windows where things didn't go as good as they should have gone. We have seen loss of performance, high latency. We have seen loss of connectivity, either randomly or during live migration or after live migration. We have seen frozen hosts and even blue screens. And the reasons for that were actually quite numerous, and everybody was a bit to blame for this. It's an advanced technology, and there were issues with it in the beginning. Now, by now, they have all been fixed, but it took us quite a while, and this is actually a screenshot from a fellow's MVP, his blog. And as you can see, everybody was quite happy when we finally figured everything out, and everybody could start enjoying VMQ. And the other thing I want to give about VMQ is if you are not running 10 gigabit today on your modern servers, but you're using 1 gigabit, which is all right. I mean, you can do a lot with 1 gigabit. VMQ is not something you need. A modern processor is so powerful, it can handle anything 1 gigabit can throw at it without much effort. So it's disabled by default, and it should be disabled by default on 1 gigabit cards. There were some bugs where it wasn't. But if you run into any issue, I think Andy would agree with me, if you run into any weird connectivity or performance issues with networking your virtual machines, this is the first suspect to check and perhaps disable to see if that fixes things.
Yeah, I think the number one thing that I've run into with VMQ is just weird latency into guest VMs. So I think the most common thing that I saw was, you know, you have normal latency for 10 seconds, and then it jumps up to 600, 800 ms latency for 10 seconds. And, you know, I've seen that a couple of different times with a certain NIC vendor that will remain nameless.
Yeah, well, I'll assure you that most NIC vendors had issues, and Microsoft had some as well. So it took a really concerted team effort to get those fixed. Now, the lesson here is whether it's ODX, OnMap, DVMQ, or other highly, let's say, advanced offloads, they are very powerful, and they are there for a reason. They bring a lot of value in regards to scalability, speed, density, whatever. But as always, with great power comes great responsibility. You always want to test and validate such features before you take them into production. And then, of course, you have the responsibility when they are in production. When you make a change, you will have to validate them again. So, okay, for Tale from the Trenches number 2, we're going to look at networking and some of the erratic connectivity behavior you might see there. Bar the VMQ issues we've already discussed, the devil is sometimes really in the details. So when things are, let's say, going wrong in a way that isn't, let's say, erratic and not consistent, there's a lot of possible causes, and you'll see connectivity that is there and then it is not. It can be fixed by live migration, or it could be caused by live migration. Sometimes it disappears, and sooner or later it will always return. So it pays to look at your configuration details with a keen eye. And the causes is, well, there's lots of them, but we'll show you a few. And let's start with a big one, duplicate MAC addresses. Those things are bad, both in the physical world as in the virtual world. And normally you would not be confronted with this, but perfection is not of this world. So what causes this? Well, perhaps people who clone their Hyper-V hosts. They end up with the same MAC address pool on every host. And then if you start live migrating, shutting down virtual machines, restarting them, sooner or later you're going to run into issues. You're also going to have problems if you create static MAC addresses and you are not carefully managing those and basically creating duplicates. There are good reasons sometimes to use a static MAC address, like for license servers that are tied to the MAC address, or network load balancers or other network appliances that require one. So those are all very valid reasons to use one. But in general, you should let dynamic MAC address assignment happen and let the technology do all the work for you. Now, when you're confronted, whatever the reason might be, with a duplicate MAC address, it's kind of tedious to troubleshoot, especially if you have multiple Hyper-V hosts in your cluster with lots of virtual machines. So it's really impractical to start clicking and looking at everything you need to look at. So here's a real nice example of where PowerShell is your friend. And in this little script that we'll run a demo of, we'll show you what we do. So let's switch to that demo and talk you through it. So what do we see here? We have virtual Hyper-V cluster with a couple of nodes, and on those nodes we have a couple of VMs that have a static MAC address, and basically we configured two of them with the same MAC address. So we'll grab all the virtual machines from the cluster, we'll get the network adapters that have a static MAC address. So we say dynamic MAC address enabled is false, and we save this in a parameter. If this parameter is not empty, we'll enumerate them and we'll start counting the MAC address. We group by the MAC address, and if we find one that's bigger than 1, we know we have a duplicate one. And then basically the next line is just making a nice little table of that information to present to us so we can easily read it. And if all is well, we'll see that we don't have any MAC addresses, static MAC addresses that have duplicates. But let's just run it and show you what happens. So what we see here is it finds 4 VMs that have a static MAC address. It finds a duplicate because it has a count of 2 for this MAC address. The group will also name the VMs, but it's not really nice to read. So what we did is create a little table output that gives you the MAC address, that's the duplicate. It gives you what network it's on or what network adapter it's on, and it tells you the VM. And basically, this is where you can that you can use to start fixing the issue. You'll need to change the MAC address of one of those, or switch to dynamic if that's possible. So it's very easy to do with PowerShell actually, and it's a very nice showcase of the power of PowerShell that you should really start to leverage if you are not already doing so, because finding out these little issues with a GUI is a tedious exercise. It's going to take you a long time. Whilst with PowerShell, you find it very quickly and easily. So as we move back to the presentation, I think Andy would agree that using PowerShell for such troubleshooting exercises is the way to go. And PowerShell in general is something that you should really add to your toolkit and your skill set.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great advice, because I think especially as more organizations start to learn about the power of PowerShell and how it can automate things in their organizations, I think it's going to become more and more of a required skill set as the technology evolves. So that's definitely great advice.
Yeah, and we've mentioned the trend to headless servers, so core or even nano server in the future, where you'll have to fall back to PowerShell for certain things. Not that you can't remote into those with GUIs. That's another thing that you can do. But there are tasks that are just not really suited for GUIs. Some tasks are brilliant to be done with a GUI, but some just aren't. And that's when you are just limiting yourself by not using or learning PowerShell. So don't do that.
Yep, excellent advice.
So let's We've had the demo, so we can skip that one. If you look at other issues we've seen, if you take a cluster with, let's say, a dozen nodes, and on all those nodes have a team NIC for your Hyper-V switch, and on one of those hosts on that team, you've put a member in the wrong VLAN. I had the honor of troubleshooting such an environment. It took me quite a while to figure out what was going on, because 12 hosts, 2 NICs per host in a team, that's 24. That's 1 in 24 times that a virtual machine would have connectivity issues. Well, it pays to be very precise in what you're doing and make sure you have nothing configured wrongly, because a switch independent team up just fine and will not warn you about this issue. Other things we've seen is jumbo frames. They tend to work quite well, but you have to configure them completely end to end on all the switch uplinks, on all the switch ports, on all the NICs, and in the VMs. So please, if you use jumbo frames and you run into issues, the biggest probability of those issues is the fact that somewhere in that network stack you've forgotten to configure it, or you have configured it differently from what other parts of that stack can handle. And perhaps one thing that's important to know is if you want jumbo frames in your virtual machines, you don't need to mess around in the registry. That's only the case when you're using network virtualization due to the extra overhead of the encapsulation. And also, of course, jumbo frames is not just about your virtual machines, your data traffic. If you leverage for storage traffic, like for an iSCSI storage array, don't forget the storage array also has to be configured for it, and your switches as well. So that's where
That's
it
a
comes into
common
play.
location that I see people forget to set that is on the storage array itself. So definitely good advice not to forget that.
So that's a little screenshot about where you can add it to registry if you need to set it for the virtual machines. But as said, if you don't use network virtualization, you do not need to go in there. It will work without it. But sometimes you'll find information that is not 100% accurate for every environment or situation. So beware of that. Know that everything on the internet, well, you have to validate it yourself partially, but also it has a value that could be limited in time due to the fact that things change, but also because environments differ. So keep that in mind.
Yep. So Tale from the Trench number 3 here. This was kind of an interesting one that I ran into a year or two back. Still, as you can see, we had an older 2008 R2 3-node Hyper-V cluster. Had been in production for a long, long time with no issues. And these particular hosts and the associated VMs were all being managed by a managed services provider. And in this situation, one day the whole cluster just went offline. I started troubleshooting the issue and found that the CSV for the cluster, the primary storage location for the virtual machines, was going offline. And I'd reboot the hosts. The host would come up, the CSV would come online, the machines would boot for about 5 minutes, and then poof, down goes the CSV again. And you could reboot it any number of times and you get the same behavior. And what I found was that antivirus was installed and running on the Hyper-V hosts themselves, and a patch released for that software ended up causing the antivirus software to start blocking iSCSI traffic, which is why it's the CSV started going offline. It was interesting that it took about 5 minutes for that process to happen, but definitely an interesting issue. So then that brings us to the conversation of antivirus on a Hyper-V host, right?
Yeah, and thank you for opening up that can of worms, right? I mean,
it is a can of worms.
I've seen so many issues with antivirus on the Hyper-V hosts. I am always very seriously evaluating in every deployment whether antivirus is going to be even deployed on those hosts or not. And it will differ a bit depending on your environment. There could be very strict policies in place that you have to, and if you have to, you must make sure that you do everything you need to make sure that your Hyper-V environment keeps working. And we've added a link with the tips up on the screen where you can find all the settings that you absolutely need to do. But still, even with that, there are some other issues you might want to be aware of. I've seen antivirus products with certain version of patches or definitions updates cause problems. Like we've seen live migrations fail at random with some antivirus products, even if you did everything according to the best practices. We've seen CSVs go into redirected mode constantly. We've seen blue screens of that when the antivirus definitions decided that some very valid Windows DLLs were malware and just quarantined them, crashing all our nodes. If you have advanced features like ODX on your file system, you better make sure your antivirus supports it. Same way for CSV. Make sure CSV is supported by the product. Other nice things you can run into if you don't follow the rules are you'll see that virtual machines are missing in your console or won't start. And if you don't put the link between that and the antivirus, you might start a troubleshooting process that's, let's say, focused on entirely the wrong reasons or causes, but it's basically just the antivirus that's causing it. So please make sure that, one, you have all the bases covered, and everything needs to be supported in your environment, CSV, ODX, if you're using that it is truly supported by the vendor.
I think it really begs the question of whether or not AV really has a place on a Hyper-V host. And don't misunderstand me. I think in high security environments, that's definitely a requirement for those organizations that require AV on everything. But I think especially if you focus on running the Hyper-V host in a smart way, having Hyper-V as the only role on that device, running it in core mode if you can, because in core mode, all the things that are usually vulnerable to viruses aren't present, right? I think that would really help in those situations where you don't want to run AV on your host.
Well, it's certainly something you want to evaluate. And I have environments where there is no antivirus running because the risks are actually higher than with having it run than not installing it. But there are other environments where we are installing antivirus. And the reason for that is that basically we don't really trust that environment that much. Things are going on there. It's an environment where one subnet has to serve everything, the clients, the servers, the smaller shops sometimes.
Right.
I'm not saying that smaller shops sometimes don't do things very well. On the contrary, I've seen some bigger companies have less well-run environments than the smaller ones. It all depends a bit on the people who are in charge or who they hire. But it's something you need to weigh. It's basically risk management. What is your big risk here?
Yep.
And that's an exercise you'll have to do for yourself.
Yep. So if we're going to move on to another thing, this is kind of a common situation, especially being hosted by a backup vendor here. So VSS issues are a very common thing that we run into working with Hyper-V, and especially trying to back up Hyper-V. So there's a number of various locations that you can run into issues inside your environment. So one, you can run into issues on the host with a VSS issue. It can be, the Hyper-V VSS writer, it could be the hardware VSS provider, it could be CSV VSS writer. So one of the most common situations that we see as a backup vendor is, issues with the VSS writer at the Hyper-V host layer. And a lot of times it's simply just a reboot of the Hyper-V host management service will resolve that issue. But not every time, but that's probably the most common solution. In the case where a CSV VSS writer goes offline, now you're starting to look at host reboots needed to try and resolve that situation. As far as the hardware VSS providers go, a lot of times it's a matter of making sure that you've got the latest version of the VSS provider from that particular vendor. And then we can also run into things inside of the virtual machines themselves too, right? You got to make sure that you have enough space for to actually conduct the backup. And we run into this situation once in a while too, where administrators or programmers or whoever gets on the virtual machine and says, "Oh, this is pending a reboot for patching," right? Oh, well, I'll just do that later, and weeks go by, and eventually, the VSS writers said, "Nope, sorry, I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore." And ultimately, you have to reboot the VM to get that to work again, right? So
that's something we see quite often.
Those are some of the most common things. What's that?
Yeah. Well, that's the not rebooting after patches in the DevOps environments. We see that quite often. It's never a good
Yeah.
It's never a good time for them, and that's the environment where we don't force the reboot, right? So
Right.
you can definitely see the difference in behavior or quality, if you want to put it that way, of the backups running in the DevOps environment versus the production environment where we lock people out mandatory and we reboot mandatory at night. It's kind of fun to see that difference. It makes a huge difference, actually. Yeah.
Right, absolutely.
And then, yeah, after the VSS issues, we've talked about bugs, we've talked about configuration problems, we've talked about issues with third-party vendors, but there is another very common cause of issues, and that's basically shooting yourself in the foot. Sometimes you do things you're not supposed to do, and you get warnings about that, and they'll try to prevent you from doing so. But if you are, let's say, motivated to do so anyway, you can do certain things that aren't supported, and then you can get into issues. And one of the most common ones is let's say the improper use of Hyper-V checkpoints or snapshots as they used to be called. And actually we have a nice demo about that. If you have a virtual machine with snapshots or checkpoints, and you extend the disk, your virtual machine will become unbootable in certain cases, and then you're stuck. And a lot of people don't put the link between those two, and then either you have to recover from backup, which is great. If you have a good backup, you should be able to do that. But there are other ways to resolve that issue, to get out of that pickle. But the main lesson, of course, here will be is know what you're doing and don't ignore warnings. So let me, actually, the slides are there for your reference later. I'm going to jump in right into the demo here. Let me go to the virtual machine. So what we have here is a lab environment with a couple of VMs. One is running a VHD, the other one is running a VHDX. What we're going to do is we are going to try and extend the disk. So if you go to settings and you go to the disk, let's say the data disk here on the SCSI controller, which you should be able to extend online, and you want to do edit, it's not available because it says, hey, checkpoints exist. So basically it's telling you, keep your hands on that. No editing something that has a checkpoint. Now if you're really motivated, or it's an IDI controller, which means that you can't extend it online, what are you going to do? Well, you are going to go to edit disk, but then it will complain that the file is in use. So if you're really determined to really do whatever you want to do, you're going to shut down that virtual machine. And some of you might be smiling now and thinking like, oh, come on, who does this? Well, I can assure you more people than you would imagine. You have a mission. You have a mission here, right? You're on a mission. So you go to edit disk. And there we go. You browse for your disk. You go to your checkpoint with VHDX, your hard disk. I'm going to take the data disk here, and I'm going to, well, nicely expand it a little bit. Let's say it's 5 gigs now. Let's make it, let's make it 6, right? There we go. So we've done that. A little bit of patience. I'm not using ODX at the home lab, so you'll have to excuse me on that one. And then we'll fire this one up. So that seems to be going all right until, of course, it doesn't. And the chain of virtual hard disks is corrupted. So what do you do now? Well, you're in a bit of a pickle if you don't know what's the root cause of this. You might think, oh my God, I have storage corruption, I have to revert to backups. What's going on here? Well, basically, you did something you were warned not to do. So what can you do? Well, actually, it's not that bad. If you're running VHDX, everything you need to fix this is available through PowerShell. And if you did this to multiple disks on a VM, you're going to have to do it for every disk. But we only did it on the data disk for the demo here, which is here. So what we'll do is we'll resize it back to what it was, to the minimum size, basically the size it was before we expanded it. That's step one. And then we'll try to boot that virtual machine, just to prove a point here. You're not home yet. It's still corrupted. There's a mismatch in the identifiers. Luckily, as long as you're using PowerShell or even with the GUI, you can do this. You can fix that mismatch. You can attach your AVHDX disk back to its parent just by running a PowerShell commandlet. So let's do that. Well, we've done it. Normally, that VM should boot again. Yeah, the demo gods are with us. It booted. Well, you got yourself out of that pickle. Now, that's VHDX. If you're running VHD, and I've prepared one before here, you can't use PowerShell commandlets to do this. It's not available. There used to be a tool by Microsoft called VHD tool, XD, that you used to create disks, to extend disks. That was a tool you needed if you wanted to do it fast because you could lose a lot of time with larger disks. In a certain version of it, they added an option repair. Now, if you think people don't do this, they basically added that option because people were doing it too often, so they had to give them a tool to get out of that pickle. And that's what this tool does. If I run this against the datafix disk, because I've already extended it, you will see that it just runs the repair for you completely. Oh, of course, that's my wrong. It's not PowerShell. It's a command line. Let's do it the way it's supposed to be done. It's quite quick, of course. It's a very small disk. Basically, it did everything it needed to do to repair that disk chain in its original state. And now that VM will also boot. So for VHDX, you can do everything you need to via PowerShell or the GUI. But if you are running a VHD, you'll need this little tool. And that's where perhaps a little bit of the bad news comes in. That tool used to be available on the Microsoft site, but it isn't anymore. So you can still find it around the internet if you look for it, but it's not officially provided by Microsoft at the moment. It's another download site run by some, I think I found it on the developer site. So use it at your own risk. And also do note there are multiple versions of this tool, and you need a more current one that has that repair option, because the original one didn't have it. They added that just because people were running into this problem too often. So that's
kind of one of those situations that a little bit of preventative medicine goes a long way there. You know, pay attention to the warnings, right?
It's reading, getting informed, studying, knowing your environment, knowing your products, and as Andy said, don't ignore the warnings. I know it's human nature, right? You know better, you want to dive in. Sometimes you just don't read it anymore because you've seen it 1,000 times, but often you only know what it meant after you've done something wrong. And well, we can only warn you about it and ask you not to do so.
Right.
So you've seen the demo, and I hope you found that one useful.
So I think that wraps up our 4 tales there. So what we're going to do now is we're going to do just a real quick overview of, Altero's flagship product, kind of what we're all about, and then we'll get into the Q&A here in a second. And I've got quite a number of interesting questions to take a look at here in a second. So really quick about our product, like I said earlier, our product is used by 30,000 plus SMBs, and we also have a nice reseller and MSP ecosystem consisting of about 4,600 of those companies. So there's 3 things that we really focus on at Altero. We focus on ease of use, because we don't think you need to have a PhD in backup systems to be able to run backup and recovery operations, right? But with that said, even though it's easy to use, we want to make sure that it's got, all of the features that people want, and it's got all the nice advanced features that people need inside of their organization, so we focus on that as well. The third thing that we really focus on is high quality support. Our support desk, they do a fantastic job. They are all engineer caliber support people, and you won't run into that situation where, oh, hey, I can tell that this person is reading off of a script, right? So we don't do that. That's one of the things that we pride ourselves on. Next slide, please.
Yep.
Thank you, sir. So we know that a large number of people that join our webinars are IT resellers. And we just want to let you know that if you're interested in joining our partner program, it's free to sign up. We provide free partner training and certification. There's no commitment. We provide some nice discounts, and you don't have to just be a reseller. You can be an MSP as well, because we know MSPs, they kind of have to deal with this, that, and everything else in the kitchen sink, right, in their environment. So we definitely want to be able to provide you some backup stuff in case you need it. If you want more information on that, you can go to altero.com/partners, or just send an email to sales@altero.com. And then finally, if you're interested in trying out our product, Altera VM Backup, you can download a free copy at altera.com, and you can get it's a 30-day full-featured trial, or it's free for 2 VMs forever. So everyone likes free, right? So if you're interested in testing it out, go ahead and go to altera.com/download.
Works in the lab.
Yep, absolutely. So I think that puts us in the Q&A section, doesn't it?
Okay, I think so. So let's have a look.
I've got a number of good questions that I saw throughout the webinar here. So let me get out the first one here. So let's go back to the cluster validation wizard. That's when I first started seeing some questions pop up here. And the question I saw asked multiple times was, is this tool runnable in a live situation?
Yes, it is, but you have to be aware of some potential issues. Mm-hmm. You can actually run everything in a live situation bar the storage. So if you are running a workload live on your CSVs, you might not want to run the storage checks because you're going to put virtual machines in paused mode and they're going to come back up. But depending on the workload that's running on them, that's not a smart thing to do or something you can perhaps do during business hours. Then again, the trick I use is you've got a witness disk on a cluster normally, or you could just add very little small test disk to your cluster. And it doesn't test all the disks in your cluster in a production environment, but if you want to check out if all the storage functionality you need to have a cluster run healthy is available and working, well, I use that little extra disk I have there, or the witness disk, for that purpose. And then you can actually run everything in production, including the storage test, but just on that disk. You leave out the disks that are running the workload in production. That's a nice thing you can do. That's the option. But otherwise, feel free to use that in a production environment. But as always, if you're not sure what you're doing and you're not really sure what to expect, you might want to test it out before you make the big punch, right?
Yep. So here, I have a question that's right up your alley, my friend, about ODX.
Okay.
So, is there a way to leverage ODX without using System Center Virtual Machine Manager?
Oh, absolutely. It has absolutely nothing to do with System Center Virtual Machine Manager. If you have a Windows operating system and that supports ODX, it's enabled by default. So if you have a storage array that has ODX, it should work. It works with basic file copies. It works with clients connecting to a file share cluster, that clients that support SMB3 and that connect to a file share cluster, they leverage ODX to copy data between servers and not pulling them over the client. So ODX in itself is a technology that's being leveraged by Hyper-V inside of the virtual machines for extending virtual disks, all kinds of use cases. But in essence, it's a technology that's not built for virtualization only, and it's also not requiring anything special or extra software to leverage. So you've got Windows 2012 or 2012 R2 or higher in the future, and your storage array supports ODX, it's there.
Good deal. So, got another one here about our MAC address conversation.
Okay.
I think what the gist of the question is, should MAC addresses be managed separately in a cluster, or should SCVMM manage them for you? They're saying we have seen MAC address changes on switches when a VM is live migrated to another host in the cluster.
If you have SCVMM, that will take care of managing the MAC addresses for you. If you don't use SCVMM, it's normally the hosts. There's all kinds of issues you can run into. Normally during a live migration, that MAC address shouldn't change. What you will see, however, is that most scenarios where I see problems is where people have this policy that have to use static MAC addresses. Sometimes you see that for people who start doing VDI. and they have a policy that a MAC address on PC is tied to security, and they take that policy to the virtualization layer. Other issues I've seen is people who clone their hosts and basically end up with the same MAC address pool on every host, and then you run into a pickle, of course. That's that kind of scenario. Should you manage them manually? The answer to that is you should avoid that at all costs. A bit like leveraging DNS. You should learn to test the quality of DNS to handle IP addresses for you. And with MAC addresses, it's exactly the same. Of course, there are scenarios where a static MAC address and manually managing a MAC address is warranted. One of the use cases we see the most is software licensing that can be tied to a MAC address. So if you do a P2V, or you migrate a virtual machine, or you want to live migrate that virtual machine, and you have dynamically assigned MAC address, well, the last thing you want to happen is that the MAC address changes and you lose the license, right? So then you will do static MAC addresses. But of course, you can always run into a situation that you land on a host and MAC addresses are being assigned dynamically and it changes. But that should not be causing issues on your network unless for some reason the ARPs that are supposed to take care of that change are causing issues somewhere or are not getting through. And we have seen issues like that with certain versions of firmware on switches where the update didn't happen, and quite a lot of them were related to the MLAG principle. In the early days of MLAG or VPC or that sort of, let's say, high available solutions for switches, the MAC address updating didn't always come through correctly at all times. But most of them that I've seen have been fixed by now. But yes, it can happen, but that does not mean that the solution is to start managing your MAC addresses all manually. Heaven forbid. It's something even in a smaller environment that's unfeasible.
Yeah, absolutely. I would never want to be in a situation myself where I'm having to keep track of MAC addresses. Like you said earlier, trust that the technology is going to do its job for you, right?
Yeah.
So I've got another one here that's strictly about VSS. How about VSS hotfixes? Should they always be installed? So I'm a firm believer in making sure that your software is up to date as often as possible. Just because a patch or a fix was released that fixes some issue that was found, right? And I would say, for me personally, the only exception that I found to that, excuse me, is with Microsoft hotfixes, because with Microsoft hotfixes, there's times where they say only apply this hotfix if you're actually seeing the symptoms. So obviously in those situations, you're going to have to take that case by case. But that's what I've operated on myself for the past, 5 or 6 years.
It's a bit of a two-way street, of course. I mean, if you look at a hotfix from Microsoft, it will make that statement: do not apply this hotfix. It has not been fully tested like a normal update, and you should only apply it when you are seeing the issues. Now, the first thing when you install a new cluster, Microsoft will tell you to do if you call for support is, have you installed all hotfixes? And they give you an exhaustive list with all those hotfixes. You download them all, and every one you want to install, and you read the let's say the TechNet article or the KB article about it. Says don't install this unless you have the issue. Well, you're installing a new cluster. You don't have any issues yet. So, I mean, I tend to deploy hotfixes regularly, but not the day they are released. So
right.
if I am not seeing the issue, I'm just playing the waiting game, and I keep an eye on the community, the forums, the TechNet forums, just to see if people are running into issues and if they are really effective at solving the issues they are seeing. And then every 3 or 4 months, we'll do run during our normal cluster aware updating runs. We'll just make sure that we also do run for the hotfixes. So we do not lag behind in our environment tremendously. That in regards to hotfixes, in regards to updates, but also in regards to firmware. Now, I'm lucky in the way that I would normally work in an environment where we have some let's say proof of concept clusters, two-node cluster that has all the same hardware we are using in production. So we can test NIC firmware, we can test NIC drivers, we can test an update for a controller, we can test hot fixes. Those tests, of course, will probably never cover all possible permutations, but at least we've got an environment where we can do our due diligence. And I fully realize and understand the pain of the smaller environments where you don't have that ability. And then it makes it a bit of a leap of faith. But if you are running a cluster, I think you would be worse off if you left that cluster for 2 years without installing a certain baseline of hotfixes.
Yes.
But if you can't test, you don't want to be the first one to do it, naturally. I mean, let us be the guinea pigs, I'll put it that way. Let the community help you out there, because that's what the community is for. We're sharing information. You can find it on the forums. So if you weigh your risk and you play it smart, you can go a long way with maintaining a healthy, up-to-date environment without bring too much risk on your environment. And basically, if you talk to any manager, IT is risk management. Sounds kind of boring as a technical person, but in essence it is. And if you can do that well, life will be a lot easier.
Yep. So let's see. Let's take a look at it. I think we've got time for another question or two here. Let's see. Boy, I got a lot of nice questions here. Just as a reminder for people, if we don't get to your question today, we'll be sure to follow up a blog post out on the Altero Hyper-V Altero Hyper-V blog, and we'll follow up to all the questions up too. So, well, let's see here. Let's see. Oh, my scroll wheel takes me all the way to the back of the question list. There we go. Okay, so what would be the cause when a Hyper-V host, 2012 R2, NIC teaming, management NIC goes to, let's see, it's kind of a wordy question here. NIC team, the management NIC goes into an unidentified state after each reboot. The NIC team has been recreated, and the NLA service has been set to delay restart. Are there other things to check on? Did you catch that? That's kind of an interesting one.
I've gotten the question, but I'm like, is this a converged network setup, or is it a NIC team dedicated to the host? So I don't know that. I have not seen that issue myself, actually.
No,
so, and it's kind of hard to to dive in and try to diagnose this based on the information I have. So I'm gonna be like a doctor here. I need to poke into the issue before I'm gonna give you my diagnostic. But I have not seen it myself, so I can't really say, hey, I had this one and that was the cause. So I can't pinpoint it for you. I'm sorry.
Yep.
Wish I could.
So here's this one always creates an interesting debate. So, have you ever experienced any issues running a domain controller as a VM? Also, do you have any tips or recommendations for maintaining a domain controller running as a VM? So, I guess I'll give my take real quick first.
Yeah, sure.
If it's a small environment, I've done it before where I've run all the domain controllers as virtual machines. Especially if it's a small 2-node cluster, what I always make sure to do is to make sure that the rules in Failover Cluster Manager are set up in a way that keeps those VMs on those domain controller VMs on separate hosts at all times, and that those virtual machines are set to auto power on. That way, if the cluster goes down, you bring those hosts back online, the VMs auto start. That way, AD becomes available, right? And at the same time, if you ever incur a host failure, making sure that those VMs are on separate hosts at any given time, you reduce your risk as well. It kind of comes back to the whole risk management thing, right? But I would say if you can, I know this is not always feasible for some organizations, if you can, try and keep a physical domain controller somewhere, right?
Well, The physical domain controller is good advice because it's something that's completely isolated from your virtual setup, and it can help. It can avoid having issues if you forgot about best practices somewhere or somehow. And actually, I have run into pickles. Basically, not because I forgot the best practices, but there was this one scenario I did not foresee, and that was during a cluster migration. A completely virtualized environment, and I was migrating to a new version of Hyper-V, and yes, none of those domain controllers were available as they were being live migrated. So that was kind of a chicken and egg syndrome, and that's one of the other elements you have to keep in mind. But have I run into issues? Have I seen a lot of issues? Absolutely. And I've gotten to the point that I tell people, look, you can safely virtualize a domain controller, but I would rather have you do this on Windows 2012 R2 than I would have you do this on Windows 2008 R2, because it has Hyper-V and domain controllers have become more aware about each other and about the fact that the domain controller is virtualized. So there are built-in protection mechanisms for you. If you combine those with the best practices you really should follow, things have become a lot safer. A CSV can come online even if it doesn't find a domain controller, right? So that's also an improvement, and those are all things that will help you avoid the most common problems. But still, issues do occur, and it's normally because something you haven't thought about, a certain permutation that you didn't foresee, and then you run into a pickle. And normally you run into a pickle at the worst possible time of the day during some upgrade, migration, scheduled maintenance. It's never a good time for those. So yes, you will see issues, but again, as with a lot of things, if you do your due diligence and you know what you're doing, it is supported and it's perfectly safe to do so, but it comes with a certain responsibility to do things right.
Yep, absolutely. So, well, I think that about wraps things up. That's all the time we have for questions. Again, real quick reminder for anyone that asked a question that we didn't get to, we'll be sure to follow this webinar up with a blog post regarding those questions that we didn't get to. So keep an eye out on the altero.com/hyper-v, that blog, and probably in a week or two we'll have that answer out there. So again, Didier, thanks for joining us today. Appreciate your time and your knowledge and insight.
Thank you. It was nice to do.
Yep. And again, thank you everyone for attending, and hopefully we'll see you next time on our next Altero webinar. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.